Our next guest has a unique vantage point at the intersection of politics and technology. Joining us right now is Sir Nick Clegg. He served as UK Deputy Prime Minister and more recently as President of Meta's Global Affairs. He's got a new book out. It's called How to Save the Internet, The Threat to Global Connection in the Age of AI and Political Conflict. It's being touted as a blueprint for balancing big tech regulation with an open internet. And Sir Nick, thank you for being here today. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Let's talk a little bit about this. You really think the internet's at risk at this point?
I think it's fragmenting. It's kind of balkanizing. You've got this kind of collision between the globalization of technology and the deglobalization of politics everywhere. So all the governments everywhere around the world are trying to do their own thing. And so the internet emerged over the years almost by accident. And I think the internet now could risk really disintegrating through neglect. And so what I argue in the book, it might seem unlikely today, but I think it's going to have to happen at some point, is that the big techno-democracies of India, the US, and Europe have got to get together at some point and put down some basic kind of guardrails, swim lanes, to keep the internet, the non-Chinese internet, open. Otherwise, I think the thing is just going to become more and more fragmented. Where
do you think the biggest risks are at this point? Because for a long time, European regulators have been the ones who have been maybe the most strident, maybe putting the most pressure on some of these big tech companies, not necessarily always over the internet, but in and around that.
Yeah, look, everyone's regulating in different ways. It's certainly outside the US. I think that you've got possibly the biggest risk of all is that this standoff between the US and China sort of pulls different countries into different orbits. I think in recent weeks, one of the most striking image I saw in sort of global affairs or global politics is the sight of Modi, the leader of the world's largest democracy, going to Beijing and standing alongside Xi Jinping, the leader of the world's largest autocracy. If India starts emulating China and starts trying to sort of cut off India, much like China has done from the rest of the internet, and they might be inclined to do so, I think that would be terrible for the kind of global open principles that the internet was based on.
They're the largest democracy in the world, in terms of population. You really think that's a risk? I hear you from what you're saying about the visuals of him standing there, but he left before the military parade. He didn't want to be up front and center for that.
He did. I think at the end of the day, this is all about power and control. Is how long would India be happy with the idea that an internet pioneered from the West Coast and the US, driven by very powerful and big American companies, how long will very proud leaders of that great country, for instance, think it's okay to have the internet more or less in the hands of people in the West Coast of the US rather than run by their own legislation, their own industry? I think there's going to be this increasing nationalism in the way in which this plays out. And at some point, in my view, it'll be in the US's interest to try and reach out to India and to the Europeans to come to some common kind of approach.
I mean, you think this is being driven by the talk of tariffs and maybe on a smaller scale, things like the H-1B visas that mostly are utilized by Indians?
That's right. I don't think it helps. I don't think it helps at the moment to try and establish that kind of spirit of partnership, which I think will be necessary to keep the non-Chinese internet open.
But you could argue the same thing with the Digital Services Act.
Oh, yeah. No, listen, I mean, I'm as critical as anybody of the Europeans' regulation. And at the end of the day, Europe's going to suffer from its own over-regulation. They've got to sort that out. Whether they will or not, it's up to them. But I guess the point of my book is I saw in the time that I worked in Silicon Valley, I worked with Mark Zuckerberg over close to 7 years. It's like a sort of boiling frog thing, this fragmentation of the internet. It doesn't capture the headlines. It happens through lots of little incremental things, lots of technical changes. There have been some near misses. Very relatively recently, the Indians were about to pass legislation to impose something called hard data localization. That means that they would have insisted all data stays about Indians in India. The moment countries start doing that, the dominoes will start to fall. If everybody says, no, we want our slice of the data cake, then, of course, the open data flows that drives the internet will start eroding.
We can talk about TikTok in a moment, but part of what's happened, this frog in a pot moment, started while you were at Meta. You've talked about Facebook's decision to ban President Trump, and you've I think, had some regrets about that.
Yeah, look, I was obviously involved in that as a decision maker at the company at the time. The decision at the time was that what happened and what appeared online was a violation of the content policies that the company
because of
had
January 6th?
Yeah, yeah. I think it is always everyone, almost whatever you think on something like that, whether you thought it was a good idea or a bad idea, everyone should feel super uneasy about private sector companies, however big they are, intervening, obviously, in the kind of public realm and around politics. Oddly enough, I, as the only sort of ex-politician in an executive position in that company in Silicon Valley, I was always advocating that it's good for these companies to keep a certain sort of distance from politics. I generally don't think that politics and tech innovation mixes very well. I think it's quite good when they kind of keep each other at a certain respectful distance.
What do you think about Joel Kaplan being in your former position at this point, kind of taking over from that? He was someone who came from the Trump administration, and it certainly looks like Mark Zuckerberg has tried to curry a little more favor with the Trump administration.
Sure. I mean, Joel Kaplan was my deputy for the whole time I was there. He's a close friend. He's an outstanding professional. He's doing an extremely good job. And certainly, I think, in these new circumstances, a much better job than I ever could possibly do. So he's doing a great job.
Well, let's talk about TikTok, because TikTok is not even allowed in China. And yet...
No, Facebook's not allowed in China. Oh, sorry. Yeah,
TikTok, too. As is TikTok. None of these social media apps are. But the idea that now we have cut a deal with China for TikTok, it still looks like there's a lot of unclear details about how this is going to work out. Yeah,
I think the jury's really out on what this deal involves. I don't know the details. There are two things I think you need to look for. Firstly, is the data for Americans, is that kept safe here and not subject to surveillance in China?
I think we feel okay with that, with the Orca database.
And then the second
question is the algorithm. What are they feeding us?
Right. And leasing an algorithm, which is what I read is the idea. I don't know what that means. I genuinely just don't know what leasing an algorithm means.
We've heard different things. In some ways, it's that the algorithm would be turned over and the American side would be responsible for maintaining it. But again, we haven't had the Chinese kind of confirm any of those details.
Right. So. And it's quite difficult to sort of share an algorithm. I mean, the engineering that goes behind TikTok's algorithm, all invented and designed in China, is a highly sophisticated thing to do. The idea that you can they do some of it and then the rest of it is done here, I don't think that's ever been done before, and that's the kind of thing that I think needs to be very closely examined to make sure that this deal does what it's supposed to do.
What would it look like if we did have this worst-case scenario that you talk about in the book, the idea that we're cutting each other off and we each live in our own little...
I think we could, in 10 years' time, look back and say, do you remember those days where you could send photos and texts and everything effortlessly from one part of the world to the other? Now there's much more friction, there's much more barriers to what we can do, what businesses can do. And I think that would be massively to the detriment of these world-beating, world-leading and extraordinary American companies that have arisen over the last 20 years in Silicon Valley.